A routine parking violation exploded into a fiery courtroom clash this morning when U.S. Representative Jasmine Crockett found herself face-to-face with a judge whose tone turned personal and possibly prejudiced. What began as a minor legal formality may ignite systemic reform. The sun hadn't yet burned through the overcast Dallas sky when Jasmine Crockett stepped through the heavy wooden doors of Municipal Courtroom 3B. Dressed in a sharp navy blue suit and heels that clicked with authority, she moved with the air of someone who didn't belong there, but had no choice. Her congressional badge didn't matter in this space. In here, she was just another defendant on the docket. Her charge? A minor parking violation, allegedly parking in a restricted city maintenance zone outside a community center during a late-night constituent outreach event. Normally, this sort of thing would have been handled with a quick online payment, maybe a warning, and definitely no fanfare. But the notice that arrived in her mailbox last week was different. Mandatory court appearance. No explanation. No option to settle. Still, it was barely a speed bump in her day. Or at least, that's what she thought. Until everything went sideways. She was late. Not fashionably, not dramatically. Just 13 minutes behind schedule. An unexpected emergency had pulled her off her route. An early morning call from a nonprofit she was partnering with on a housing protection bill. ICE had shown up at an apartment complex in her district, violating federal housing protocols she'd just fought to reinforce. She stayed on the phone with legal aid teams and local reporters as long as she could before rerouting to the courthouse. But late was late, and Judge John Parker was not the kind of man who tolerated deviations. A former federal prosecutor turned county judge, Parker was infamous in legal circles for his rigid style and his biting, often patronizing tone, particularly when addressing defendants who didn't fit the white-collar profile. He called her, case with an impatient sigh, and when she wasn't present, he moved on. So when she finally appeared, breath short but voice calm, the mood in the courtroom shifted. Parker's face tightened like a clenched fist. "Well, well," he said, drumming a pen against his bench. "Congresswoman Crockett graces us with her presence." There was a low shuffle among the few spectators in the gallery, court staff, a reporter from a local independent news outlet, and a few defendants waiting their turn. Crockett stood firm, ignoring the tone. "I apologize for my delay, Your Honor. I don't care what you were doing. You've wasted this court's time," he snapped. "You may be used to people waiting on you in Washington, but down here we run things on schedule." "I understand, but if I may, I'd like to explain." "You may not. Sit down. You're being held in contempt. $750 fine. Payable today." The gavel came down hard. A stunned silence washed over the room. Crockett didn't flinch. Her voice stayed even, deliberate. "With all due respect, Your Honor, you've allowed at least 2 other defendants before me to explain their circumstances, one of whom arrived over 20 minutes late." Parker leaned forward. "Are you accusing this court of inconsistency?" "I'm asking whether this court applies equal standards to everyone who walks through that door," she replied. His jaw clenched, nostrils flared. "This isn't a political stage, Congresswoman." "No," she said, "it's supposed to be a court of law. But you're treating me like this is a performance, one with a very specific script, especially for people who look like me." The room went dead quiet again. Even the bailiff shifted uneasily. Judge Parker's eyes narrowed. "If you're suggesting bias—" "I'm not suggesting anything," she said. "I'm stating what I see. And what I see is a pattern." A slow burn ignited in the air. The temperature wasn't rising from the thermostat, but from the pressure, the kind that builds when someone dares to question a system that's used to going unchallenged, especially by a black woman in power. "Do you plan to grandstand for much longer?" Parker hissed. "Because I can add jail time to that contempt charge if you'd prefer." Crockett paused, considering the weight of her next words. "I've spent my life in courtrooms like this one, Your Honor. First as a public defender, then as a civil rights attorney, now as someone who writes the laws you're sworn to uphold. I'm not afraid of your threats. I'm not afraid of calling out what I see." The room seemed to hold its breath. "And if you think intimidating me with jail or fines will keep me quiet," she added, her voice now cutting through the stillness like a scalpel, "then you don't know me at all." For a split second, Parker looked genuinely rattled. But he wasn't the kind of man to retreat. He dug in. "Your attitude is contemptuous of the very system you claim to defend," he said. "You're not above the law, Ms. Crockett." "No," she replied, "but neither are you." A whisper of shock swept through the courtroom. Even the reporter had his pen frozen mid-sentence. Judge Parker pounded the gavel again, 3 sharp, knocks that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. "Enough. We'll continue this after a short recess." As he stormed out through the side door, Jasmine remained standing, unmoved. Her arms rested by her side, fists unclenched but ready. The murmurs in the gallery picked up. Someone pulled out their phone. Someone else whispered, "Did she just say that to a judge?" But Jasmine didn't speak again. She simply looked around the courtroom, eyes steady, knowing this wasn't over. This was the opening move, and what came next would shake the foundation of everything that courtroom claimed to stand for. The bailiff called for a 10-minute recess, but the tension in the air refused to recess with it. Jasmine Crockett stood alone before the empty bench as murmurs swelled behind her. Some defendants averted their eyes, unsure if they had just witnessed bravery or the kind of misstep that gets quietly buried. Others, especially those who had clearly stood in that courtroom before, watched with a quiet reverence, as if they knew that someone had finally said aloud what they'd only dared to think. She didn't move to sit. Her body remained still, spine straight, eyes locked on the judge's exit door like a soldier waiting for the next charge. She wasn't afraid, but she was calculating. She knew what Judge Parker was. She'd known the moment he spoke over her, dismissed her reason, and hit her with a contempt charge faster than he flipped through her case file. This wasn't just about her parking ticket or her being late. This was about power, about a judge used to using it indiscriminately and never being challenged by someone with enough weight behind their voice to matter. Jasmine had seen this before. She'd seen it in the way public defenders scrambled in his courtroom, how young black men were cut off mid-sentence, how Latina mothers trying to explain eviction complications were reduced to eye rolls and $200 fines. She saw it all again now, but this time it was on her. When Parker returned, no robe adjustments, no sign of reconsideration, he walked in like he was coming to shut something down, like he was ready to bury this moment beneath a layer of formal procedure and legal jargon. But Jasmine was still standing. She didn't sit when the gavel knocked again. Didn't blink. He looked at her like a problem. She looked back like a mirror. "Court is back in session," he said with clipped efficiency. "Miss Crockett, you may take your seat." "With respect, Your Honor," she said calmly, "I'd like to address the court before proceeding further." "That's not how this works," Parker said. "You don't get to make speeches here." "I'm not making a speech," she said. "I'm filing a motion." He squinted. "On what grounds?" "Motion to dismiss the contempt charge on the basis of unequal application of courtroom protocol and racially biased conduct." The courtroom stirred. Parker laughed, short, mean, incredulous. "You're accusing me of racial bias because you showed up late to court?" "I'm identifying a pattern," Jasmine replied, "and entering that pattern into the record." She held up her phone. A note-taking app glowed on her screen. "I've been here long enough to witness 4 cases before mine. 2 defendants arrived late. Both were white. Both were allowed to explain their reasons. One was given a new court date. The other was told, and I quote, 'Life happens.' Neither were fined. Neither were threatened with contempt." "That's your evidence?" Parker scoffed. "Loose observations? I've also pulled transcripts," she said, lifting a folder from her bag. "I had my staff research a year's worth of decisions in your courtroom. We found a statistically significant trend. Non-white defendants were 5 times more likely to receive maximum fines for misdemeanors, 7 times more likely to be cited for contempt. I'm submitting those findings for review." "You're out of line," he snapped. "This is a parking violation, not a political campaign." "This is justice," she said, "and you're not the one who gets to define its boundaries anymore." "You want to drag this out? Fine," he barked. "I'll see your motion, and I'll double the contempt fine. $1,500, due today, or I'll hold you in custody until it's paid." Now the tension broke into outright gasps. Someone cursed under their breath. The reporter in the back stood up, pressing a recorder forward. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "Are you seriously threatening to jail a sitting member of Congress over a parking ticket? You're not here as a member of Congress. You're a defendant, and you're behaving like one who believes the rules don't apply to her." "No," Jasmine said, stepping forward. "I'm behaving like someone who's spent her career watching men like you hide behind the rules to excuse mistreatment." Parker's jaw moved, like he was trying to chew through his own fury. "Bailiff—" "Hold on," Jasmine said, and she turned, not to the judge, but to the gallery. "Is anyone else here willing to speak on what they've seen today?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Silence. Then, a middle-aged black man in a windbreaker stood. He held a manila envelope to his chest like it might shield him. "My name's Aaron Daniels," he said, voice wavering but clear. "I came in late, too. 10 minutes. I tried to tell the judge it was because my dialysis ran long. He wouldn't listen. Hit me with $500. I ain't even got that." Jasmine nodded once. Another hand rose. A young Latina woman stood up, her arms wrapped around her chest. "He didn't let me talk either. I had my son with me. I was asking for time to get him to daycare, and he said I was wasting court resources." The judge slammed his gavel again. "This isn't a town hall. Sit down, all of you." But the courtroom had shifted. The fear that usually filled these walls was cracking. Jasmine didn't flinch. She turned back to Parker. "There's your pattern, and this is only the beginning. I've already contacted the State Bar and the Judicial Conduct Commission. This hearing, Judge, is now officially under review." He opened his mouth, but didn't speak. She could see it in his eyes now. Not the anger, the fear. Just a flicker. For the first time, John Parker understood that this wouldn't disappear. That Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another defendant. That this wasn't going to be forgotten by noon. This would spread. And Jasmine? She was just getting started. The courtroom had shifted from a sterile chamber of routine justice to the eye of a storm. Whispers buzzed like static, defying the gavel's desperate thudding. Judge John Parker's voice grew louder, trying to wrangle order, but no one was listening. Jasmine Crockett stood unbothered amid the noise, her presence commanding, not loud, just immovable. "Silence in this courtroom," Parker bellowed, rising halfway from his bench. "This circus ends now." But the circus wasn't in session. This was a reckoning. "I'm exercising my right to speak, under both judicial review guidelines and the Texas Code of Judicial Conduct," Jasmine said, her voice unwavering. "You don't get to shut this down just because it makes you uncomfortable." His lips curled. "You're grandstanding again." "I'm testifying," she corrected. "I'm exposing." Outside the courtroom, word had already begun to spread. One of the reporters, whose quiet presence Judge Parker hadn't even registered before, had stepped into the hallway. He was live streaming now. Jasmine's clash with the judge was no longer confined to the dull echo of courtroom 3B's walls. It was bleeding into screens, into timelines, into inboxes of city officials and civil rights attorneys. Inside, the judge could feel it slipping. The control. The script. "You've manipulated courtroom norms for years," Jasmine continued, keeping her gaze pinned on Parker, "wielding discretion like a weapon. You interrupt defendants of color. You fine disproportionately. You strip people of their dignity while hiding behind the letter of the law. You're dangerously close to slander, Parker warned, his voice low and tight. No, Jasmine said, walking forward now. I'm dangerously close to truth, and truth doesn't need your permission. Her motion had been officially filed, and she'd invoked precedent that would make Parker's next moves scrutinized at every level. But what followed next wasn't legal. It was personal, and everyone in that room could feel it. Parker sat back, eyes narrowed. He didn't strike the gavel again. He didn't yell. He just looked at her and said, "You people always want special treatment." A vacuum sucked the air out of the room. Jasmine's eyes sharpened. "Repeat that. I said you people." "No. Louder," she demanded, stepping even closer to the bench. "Say it again, for the transcript, for the cameras, for the commission." Silence. A slow dawning dread crept into the judge's face. Too late. The court reporter's hands hadn't stopped moving. The live stream had a clear shot, and Jasmine had just baited him into confirming everything she'd implied. The moment crystallized, sharp and undeniable. "This isn't just misconduct," she said softly. "This is racial animus in a courtroom." From a judge, under oath. He started to speak, but the bailiff stepped forward, hand lightly raised as if preparing to intervene, not against Jasmine, but against the unraveling judge. "Your Honor," the bailiff said cautiously, "you might want to take a recess." "There will be no recess," Parker growled. But his voice was losing its grip. He looked past Jasmine now, beyond the doors, where someone had just entered the back of the courtroom. Two someones, actually. One wore the badge of the Judicial Oversight Committee. The other, a camera strapped over his shoulder, recording everything. The door hadn't just opened. It had been kicked in. Jasmine turned, her voice now measured for the room in the lens. "I've requested a formal review of Judge Parker's courtroom conduct, effective immediately. This court session is under third-party observation, and any additional punitive measures he attempts to levy today will be recorded and evaluated under the standards of retaliatory judicial behavior." Parker leaned forward, almost hissing. "You don't have the authority." "No," Jasmine said, "but the Constitution does. And the people I represent? They're watching." The two observers moved closer. One handed Jasmine a folded document, confirmation of the inquiry's expedited approval. Judge Parker's eyes scanned the seal and signature and seemed to realize, in that second, he was no longer the most powerful man in the room, but he still had venom. He spat it like a man with nothing left to lose. "I've sat on this bench longer than you've had a law degree." "Exactly," Jasmine replied. "And that's the problem." A low rumble of support moved through the gallery. More people were standing now, some filming, others simply watching, wide-eyed, as the walls of immunity Judge Parker had hidden behind for decades cracked. "You came in here with a parking ticket," he sneered almost laughably. "And now what? Think you've won something?" Jasmine tilted her head. "No, I didn't win anything. We are taking something back." The phrase echoed in the room like prophecy. Because outside, change was already moving. Local news stations were picking up the live stream. Hashtags had begun. Trending. "So Parker exposed." "Courtroom bias." "Stand with Jasmine." Former defendants were coming forward on social media. Civil rights groups began issuing statements within the hour. And within the State Bar Association, an emergency panel had been called. But none of that mattered in this exact moment. This moment belonged to the people still sitting quietly in the courtroom. Those who'd been fined, talked over, dismissed. And to Jasmine, who had taken the blows, pushed back, and refused to shrink. Judge Parker straightened in his seat like a man clinging to the last remnants of authority. "Your motion is noted. Your contempt fine stands. I'm concluding this hearing. You don't get to conclude what isn't yours anymore," Jasmine said. "You'll remain seated. Oversight is present. From this point forward, any decision you make is subject to immediate reversal." He looked over at the observers again. This time, they didn't nod. They didn't speak. But their presence spoke volumes. Jasmine had flipped the balance of power. Now he was the one on trial. The courtroom was still. Not quiet, not chaotic, just holding its breath. And as Parker sat silently, visibly shaken for the first time since putting on his robe, Jasmine turned to face the crowd behind her. "Not the judge. Justice doesn't just live in the law," she said. "It lives in who's allowed to speak, and be heard, and seen." Today, this courtroom finally saw what it's been ignoring for years. No one applauded. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was heavier than that, and it wasn't over. Because outside these walls, the fight she'd started was just beginning to stretch its legs. By the following morning, the story had grown legs, lungs, and a pulse strong enough to shake the Texas legal system awake. What had begun as a parking violation had evolved into a full-blown public reckoning. Jasmine Crockett's confrontation with Judge John Parker had gone viral overnight. The full courtroom video, grainy but unmistakably damning, made its way across every major social media platform and had even reached national headlines by sunrise. Congresswoman challenges biased judge in fiery courtroom showdown. Texas judge faces scrutiny. After alleged racially charged court incident, Jasmine Crockett turns parking violation into catalyst for reform. But back inside the courthouse, the reckoning wasn't finished. The Judicial Oversight Committee convened an emergency hearing. It was unprecedented in speed. What had historically taken weeks, sometimes months, was now compressed into hours. The public attention, the irrefutable video evidence, and the growing chorus of former defendants sharing near-identical stories had accelerated the machinery of accountability in a way rarely seen. Jasmine was present, seated in a sterile but glass-walled conference room alongside her attorney and members of her team. Across from her sat Judge John Parker, not behind a bench, not robed in authority, but seated like any other man summoned to answer for his actions. He looked smaller now. The oversight panel, a group of 5, including 2 retired judges, a civil rights attorney and a community advocate, began the inquiry with formality. They reviewed the transcript, played the courtroom footage again, asked Jasmine questions, not about her parking ticket, but about what she saw, what she heard, and what she'd experienced. "I didn't come into that courtroom looking for a fight," she said clearly. "But I wasn't going to let silence validate something that's been happening for too long. Not just to me, but to people who don't have the position, the profile, or the platform to speak up." They turned to Parker next. His answers were colder, calculated. Her behavior was disruptive, he insisted. "She was late. She disrespected the court." One panelist leaned forward. "Do you deny using the phrase, 'you people'?" Parker hesitated. "It was taken out of context." "You said it in open court," the panelist countered. "There is no context that makes it acceptable." The silence that followed said more than Parker ever could. Outside, supporters gathered on the courthouse steps. Some held signs, "Justice for all, not just some." Others passed out pamphlets detailing courtroom rights. Community leaders, legal activists, and even former defendants from Parker's docket gave impromptu press conferences. One man, teary-eyed, told a reporter, "He fined me $750 for missing court due to my son's surgery. I thought it was just me. Now I know it wasn't." By late afternoon, the panel reconvened for a final statement. Jasmine stayed quiet, her hands folded, breath steady. Judge Parker stared straight ahead. After reviewing the conduct statements and courtroom record, the lead panelist announced, "This committee finds substantial evidence of judicial misconduct and implicit racial bias in the courtroom of Judge John Parker." A pause. Then, "We are recommending immediate suspension pending formal disciplinary proceedings. Furthermore, an ethics investigation will be initiated to determine whether Judge Parker has violated the Texas Code of Judicial Conduct to a degree warranting permanent removal from the bench." Parker's face barely twitched. But Jasmine saw it. The crack. The fracture in a man who'd never imagined he'd have to answer to the very system he once ruled. He stood slowly, prepared to exit with what dignity he had left. But he didn't get far. Two uniformed officers were already waiting at the side door. "This is standard," the oversight panelist said firmly. "Pending suspension includes revocation of judicial access, court-issued equipment, and privileges. Judge Parker, you are not to enter any courtroom as an official until this investigation concludes." He didn't speak, didn't argue. He simply nodded once, a silent surrender, and walked out of the room with the slow, unfamiliar gait of a man no longer in charge. The media was already there when Jasmine exited. Cameras clicked. Microphones were extended like weapons. Questions, overlapping in a cacophony of sound. "Congresswoman Crockett, will you be filing a civil suit? Do you think the judge should be criminally charged? Was this about race or power? Would this have happened if you weren't who you are?" She raised her hand and the crowd quieted. "This isn't about me," she said. "This is about everyone who's walked into a courtroom expecting justice and been met with something else. Today wasn't about vengeance. It was about visibility, about fairness, and about change." She stepped down the courthouse steps, but the impact of what she started continued to climb. In the weeks that followed, reforms moved swiftly through the state legislature, backed by bipartisan support, sparked by national pressure. Mandatory bias training for all sitting judges. A new statewide judicial review board with independent civilian oversight. Protections for defendants to report suspected bias without fear of retaliation. More importantly, the culture began to shift. Quietly, unevenly, but noticeably. Judges across Texas were reminded that their benches weren't thrones. Lawyers began to challenge subtle biases more openly. Court reporters started to record not just the words spoken, but the tone and timing. The public paid attention. As for Jasmine, she returned to Washington, but her focus remained sharp. She introduced a federal bill, the Judicial Equity and Accountability Act, which sought to standardize courtroom bias reviews across all 50 states. It picked up support faster than anyone expected. Back in her district, murals went up, not just of her, but of the moment. A painted courtroom wall, a black woman standing tall, a white judge slumped behind a bench, and the words, "She didn't bow, so we could rise." Jasmine Crockett hadn't walked into that courtroom to become a symbol. She went in to handle a parking ticket, but by refusing to shrink, refusing to yield to a broken system, and refusing to let injustice pass unchallenged, she lit a fire that forced change into motion. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with resistance, resolve, and the law itself. And that, in the end, was her victory.